Good morning. I'm Sherman Stanford, and this is Making Sense of the Chaos. There are a few principles that have to be borne in mind if we're going to make sense of the chaos. We have to have a framework, a skeleton, as it were, so that we can hang the individual facts on and make sense of them, because a fact all by itself is really meaningless. So these are the principles I would have you bear in mind. I think that they're abstracted correctly and truly from the Bible, and reflect what the Bible has to say about what really is going on in the world every moment of our lives. First, God created the cosmos for his glory, not for man's glory. Second, the jewel of creation is mankind. Third, although in no sense the author of evil, God, as the sovereign creator of the universe, ordained Adam's fall. Now, that's a very difficult thing for us to understand. And the truth is, I don't think that anyone has ever explained it fully, but the Bible clearly teaches that's true. And so our choice is to say, well, I'm not going to believe what I can't understand, or we can say, I'm going to believe what God explains as true, because there are just way too many things I can't understand anyway. And if I insisted on not believing all things I could not understand, I would not be able to function at all. Do you understand how language works? No, you don't. You're able to make it work, but you don't understand how to invent language, but you use it. Fourth, in Adam, the entire creation fell. Everything, the physical cosmos, all of humanity, it all fell. What does that mean? Well, that's what the Bible explains. 5, as a result of the fall, God pronounced a curse of enmity, hostility, between the seed of the woman, Jesus Christ, and all those in him, and the seed of the serpent, Satan, Adam, fallen Adam, and all those in him. This is known as the great antithesis. 6th, all human subsequent social experience is an outworking of this hostility, or at least of this enmity, of this division. 7, the unregenerate are without excuse. They know God, but suppress the truth in culpable self-deceit. Yesterday, I read a long passage out of John's Gospel talking about, in fact, the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent. Jesus says, you are of your father, the devil. He speaks of his father and their father, two different things. And I've been thinking about that since yesterday, and I'm thinking that maybe I'm not doing a very good job of explaining what exactly that means and how that affects God as a loving God, because certainly popularly we're taught that God is a God of love, and he is. There's no question about that. But the problem that most of us have is that we condition our view of love based upon the cultural view of love, a sort of bland, affirming, non-judging, accepting whatever we do, unconditional. And there is a sense in which God's love is unconditional, or at least that the conditions are met in him, not in us. And that's his love for the elect. But what you have to understand is that humanity, all of humanity, fell. And what that means is not just that a sin was committed, it's that the orientation of all of humanity has been switched, has been turned. If you imagine a compass, okay? You look at the compass, and the way that you can find out where you're going, or where you are, what direction you're headed in, is because the needle of the compass always points to true north, or at least magnetic north. And then it's adjusted, on the good compasses adjust that so you'll know where true north is. But at any rate, that compass will always point in the northern hemisphere north. Okay? So we're oriented based upon, in terms of direction, based upon the compass always pointing north. Now, if you consider human nature and what happened at the fall, is that human nature, the compass of human nature was pointed toward God before the fall. After the fall, it switches around and is pointed in the opposite direction. And it never points toward God again until God, person by person, changes the orientation of that person's compass to have it turned back toward Him. Now, it's not just a question of a compass being turned away from true north. It's a question of the orientation of that person being not God instead of God. If all of our thoughts begin with who God is and who we are and the proper relationship between us and Him, then our compass is pointed in the right direction. And inasmuch as every aspect of our life is oriented toward God, we're pointed in the right direction. But because we are complex creatures, and even though our overall compass gets reoriented back toward God when we're converted, when we're regenerated, that doesn't mean that every aspect of us is pointed toward God. There's still a lot of stray elements that point the wrong direction and have to get realigned. But what you need to understand about God is that when He's viewing fallen humanity, He's seeing all of these people whose compasses are turned away from Him, not toward Him, who hate Him, and who, although He created them, who want to live their lives as if He does not exist and has no say in what they think, what they say, and what they do. Nevertheless, He continues to feed them. He continues to give them water. He continues to give them gifts. I mean, look around you. How many people that you know who don't believe in God, who prosper very well on the earth? Why do you think that's so? Who gave them the gifts they have? I remember watching a movie years ago, The River, with Sissy Spacek and Mel Gibson. And Mel Gibson was saying grace. And essentially, he thanked himself for his hard work in producing the food and the money that provided their raiment and everything else, their clothing. But that misses the point. Who gave him his life? Who gave him his strength? Who gave him his gifts that he uses to produce food and money? And you see, this is the orientation. This is the classic orientation of someone pointed away from God. Now, if you were God and had made that character in that movie, and he thanks himself for the gifts you gave him, you'd like that? You'd say, oh, well, I approve of that. It's okay. Basically, that's fine. No. So you need to understand, this is not about basically good people who made a small error. No. Their lives are turned away from God. They are dedicated to their own desires against God's desires. That's what's really going on, okay? And not only does He give all of these people the rain and the sunshine, but He takes some of them, not that He owes any of them anything, but he feeds all of them, and He takes some of them and He turns them around and He reorients their compass toward Himself in spite of their rebellion. He removes the scales from their eyes so they can see Him. This is an act of such incomparable love. I simply don't have any words for it. I get up in the morning and I go out for a walk. I look outside and I see the stars and the trees and the grass, and it's just, God created all of this. He created me. He created all of my. He gave me all of my gifts. He gives me everything I deserved. None of that. And so because he saves some and doesn't save all, that's not a blight on his character. That testifies to his phenomenal love for having saved anyone. If he saved just one, that would show his love. But he saves many more than one. But because he doesn't save all, people want to blame him. You know, I hear people say, well, if God is all powerful and he's all good, why doesn't he just get rid of evil? Well, now, would the person saying that want God to start with himself? Should God kill that person because there's plenty of evil in that person's heart? No, we want God to kill the evil out yonder, not in us. It's nonsense. It's nonsense. No, God is a God of love. So all of the things I've talked about, if I have failed to convey that truth, it's my fault, okay? Blame me, because I assure you that God is a God of love, and I love him deeply, more each day because of what I see he does in the world, what he does for me that I don't deserve, what he does for others. It's just more than I can even express. Anyway, today we're going to talk about judging. Having spent this time talking about God's love, we're going to move to judging. That sounds good, right? And determining how we should act toward others. That is, in figuring out who belongs in which basket, the seed of the serpent, the seed of the woman. Bearing in mind the enmity God has placed between the two seeds, we are forced to make judgments about who belongs to which seeds. However, there is a strong current cultural assumption that judging is forbidden to Christians. It is widely believed that any judging between individuals or groups is evil. At least it's said. On the contrary, however, judging is inescapable. Now I'm going to show you that. And simply living from day to day, no one can avoid judging. True judging should be the aim. False judging avoided. The existence of standards of behavior is universal and inescapable. You say, really? Everybody has a standard of behavior? Well, no, I know people who do wrong things. They violate, yes, but they violate a standard that's held either by them or someone else. Whenever you see anybody doing something that you think is wrong, they violated at least your standard. And there's no one in the world who benignly accepts any behavior at all. There are behaviors that everyone will find objectionable, will paint as wrong. Every group of people has behavioral expectations of other group members, whether deliberately intended or not. They eventually morph into reasonably clearly understood do's and don'ts. When a law or custom is asserted, no matter the situation or context, it becomes a standard of behavior to the precise extent that it is accepted and enforced as true and valid by others. For those who accept and follow the standard, deviation from that standard will be implicitly or explicitly judged as wrong for those who deviate. Keeping the standard will be judged as right. Imagine, if you will, a gang of Hell's Angels. Now, those people don't have any standards at all, do they? I mean, they have no standards. They do just about anything. Oh, yeah? Well, imagine this. Imagine one of the members arriving at a meeting of the Hell's Angels, clean shaven, freshly bathed, with a neat short haircut, wearing a businessman's gray pinstriped three-piece suit, speaking impeccable English, refusing to swear, do drugs, drink, or engage in any of the gang's riotous, lawless behavior. Would he continue to be passively accepted as a full-fledged member in good standing? Or would he be lucky to escape with his life and health intact? Well, you know the answer as well as I do, don't you? So they do have standards, don't they? Even the Hells Angels have standards. May not be your standards, but it's their standards. The standard is a standard, whether held by an individual only, that is, you can be the only one who follows the beat of your drum. You have your own standard. You follow your own standard. You ignore everybody else. Now, of course, you have to deal with all of the times that you run afoul of other people's standards. But still, if you claim X is good and not doing X is bad, you've established a standard, at least with regard to that behavior. It's unavoidable. Can't get around it, guys. Can't get around it. The standard may have the force of law. It may have the force of custom. It may only have the force of personal approval or disapproval by those whose approval we value. Ourselves, for instance. Nevertheless, violations of the standard will be judged and will invariably carry sanctions. Something going to happen. Or else the standard is merely a suggestion, not a standard at all. Even the idea that we are not supposed to judge others is itself a standard. Think about it. When somebody says to you, after you've said, hey, what you're doing is wrong, God says don't do that. And they say, well, judge not lest you be judged. Judge not lest you be judged. Ooh. What if you would say to them, are you judging that I'm judging? Because they are. You see? Even in telling you not to judge them, they're judging you. You can't avoid it. You can't avoid it everywhere you go. There you are. That was a story told by Jane Fonda's father. What was his name? Anyway, he was shopping at 2 o'clock in the morning in LA at a supermarket, and some woman sees him there, and she says, I can't believe it's you. I can't believe it's you, a famous movie star, 2 o'clock in the morning shopping at this supermarket. He said, every minute of the day, everybody got to be somewhere. That's true. And wherever you go, there you are. And also your standard of judgment. Moreover, no one uniformly practices non-judging of others' behavior. You don't, I don't, no one does. To do so would require acceptance of any possible behavior, including the most heinous behaviors imaginable. No one fails to judge as wrong the violation of his own personal standard. Not you, not me, not anyone. Furthermore, when a standard of non-judging is asserted, the real but unspoken standard is against judging selected behaviors that are either openly or tacitly approved by those asserting the non-judging standard. Okay? Outside of the charmed circle of so-called non-judgment, behaviors remain fair game for being judged. Think about it. Interestingly, by the way, those individuals quickest to object to others judging their behavior are strangely silent if those judgments are affirmative rather than negative. For instance, if you were to tell someone who doesn't like your judging some other action of theirs, okay, you say, you know, I think you're a really good person. Would they say, judge not lest you be judged? Let me guess. No. They'd be happy to hear that. They don't mind your judging if your judgment happens to coincide with their own. It's when your judgment conflicts with theirs. That's when you're not supposed to judge. Listen, and you think God should love all of this behavior and all of these people who do these things, including me and you? Give me a break. Whether the idea of standards is ostensibly embraced or rejected, standards of behavior remain inescapable. Even for those who reject standards, that rejection itself becomes a standard. Everyone who lives and acts expresses what he believes is right or wrong by his own behavior. Think about it. Do you intentionally do something you believe is wrong? No. You believe when you're doing it, it's good and right for you. You may believe everybody else in the world thinks it's wrong, but you don't. All things considered, at that moment, for you, that behavior is judged good. May be wrong, but that's another question. Everyone who lives and acts expresses what he believes is right or wrong by his behavior. The question is never whether standards must and do exist. The questions are what ought our standards to be, what ought to be the basis of that standard, and do we faithfully follow the standard? Actual standards always exist and they're always enforced. Really? Really? Think about it. When you're driving down the road and you see a sign and it says, speed limit 50, but you know that you've got to go 60 before you get a ticket. All right? What's the visible standard? 50. What's the actual standard? 60. Now, how do you know that? Because the real standard is the one that's enforced. If going 55 won't get you a ticket, then believe me, 50 miles per hour is not the limit beyond which you'll get a ticket. It's what they tell you is the limit, but that's not the true limit. The true limit is 60. Try going 65 and see whether you get a ticket. And there's a policeman around, you will. You may be fortunate and can't encounter any. But that is the real standard then. And it's true in every area of life. No doubt this sounds strange to most American ears. The commonly accepted narrative in America is that we are all about personal freedom. Personal freedom. And as proof of this truth of this dogma, we're shown the liberalization of cultural norms regarding sexual mores, for instance. Premarital sex, it's okay. Casual couplings, live-in arrangements, all promoted as alternative lifestyles. How about the growing acceptance of homosexuality and genderism? We're told they point toward freedom and away from restrictive standards. But is that true? Let's think about that a bit. The truth is not so neat. What has occurred is a shifting of standards, not an abandonment of standards per se. The proof of this is that the minority who oppose the new standards, stand up and say homosexuality is wrong and see what happens to you. What? You will meet with social sanctions ranging from expressions of mild disapproval to very strong expressions of intense disapproval, including sometimes legal action by those who value and accept the new standards. An example of legal sanctions is the legal action taken against bakers, for instance, for refusing to participate in homosexual weddings by baking wedding cakes for homosexual couples. If you can't have a homosexual marriage, according to definition, and God defines what marriage is, how can you have a wedding cake for homosexuals? Duh. Obviously, I have a standard myself, don't I? It's God's standard. Frankly, personally, homosexuality doesn't offend me at all. But it offends God. And so I must always act in terms of what God says. Act as if it's an offense, whether I personally feel offended. That's not the question. The question is not, is my screwy standard the one? No. God's standard is the one. What I feel about that doesn't matter. What I do about that, which standard I articulate and support, matters. What I feel about it doesn't matter at all. Okay? Gambling doesn't bother me, but it bothers God. And so I have to stand against gambling. There's all kinds of sins that don't bother me at all. Don't bother me at all. That reminds me when I was a kid, my father accused me of being afraid of hard work, but I can tell you that's not true. I have stood right next to people working very, very hard and never blinked. Never blinked. I'm not afraid at all. I'm being silly today. Moreover, every law, either compelling or forbidding behavior of any kind, is an act of judging. Think about it. Since all laws either compel or forbid various actions, all laws are examples of cultural judging. A standard is advanced which the governing authority avers it will enforce. In short, judging is inescapable for human beings in the same way that standards of behavior of one kind or another are always inescapable. As an aside, the notion of toleration as a virtue is nonsense. Think about that. It's a virtue to say, I tolerate somebody. I mean, if someone comes to you and puts his arm around you and says, brother, I want you to know I really tolerate you. You'll enjoy that, huh? Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. That's not a virtue. I'm sorry. No one practices this virtue universally. No one can practice it universally. That would require tolerating the murderer murdering us or the thief robbing us. The truth is that everyone has a graded standard of morality. There are behaviors that are highly approved, behaviors mildly approved, behaviors accepted indifferently, behaviors mildly disapproved, behaviors strongly disapproved, and behaviors very strongly disapproved. No one tolerates behaviors strongly or very strongly disapproved if they can possibly help it. And it's meaningless to speak of tolerating behaviors that are approved. Do you tolerate people treating you well? Of course not. You welcome it. You don't tolerate it. Voluntary toleration only applies to indifferent or disapproved behaviors. Okay? The real question is which behaviors belong to which category for a person, a group, a subculture, or a culture, or by what standard. Once that is decided, the question of toleration then enters the door, not before. Conflicts occur at the stage of determining which behaviors belong to which categories, not over whether we are to tolerate every kind of behavior. No one tolerates strongly disapproved behaviors unless there's a gun pointed at their head of one kind or another. Some will ask, well, doesn't Jesus himself forbid judging? Much confusion exists regarding this issue. In the popularly quoted passage from Matthew's Gospel, Jesus said, "Judge not that you be not judged." This was chapter 7, verse 1. Quote, "Judge not that you be not judged, for with the judgment you pronounce, you will be judged. And with the measure you use, it will be measured to you." End quote. Now, superficially, you got to admit, that sounds definite. Don't judge. However, just 23 verses later, in verse 24, same chapter in John, Jesus said, "Do not judge by appearances, but judge with right judgment." So, what we have is, in verse 1, he says, "Judge not." Then in verse 24, he says, "Judge with right judgment." Well, is he contradicting himself? Remember, contradictions destroy any belief system, any system of thought. Cannot have contradiction. So if you're going to believe that verse 1 is true, in the sense that you want to say he says he bans all judging, period, and you're going to believe verse 24 is true, that says judge with right judgment is true, well, then you got a contradiction. So how do you resolve that? Unless we are willing to face the consequences of believing that Jesus contradicts himself, we must harmonize the two passages and admit that judging is, therefore, an inescapable concept. Furthermore, Jesus' words in Matthew's Gospel were embedded in the Sermon on the Mount, a lengthy exposition on how to act, God's law, a standard of behavior. The entire sermon was an extended discourse on right judgment as opposed to wrong judgment. offering rules of conduct across a broad range. Moreover, even the admonition not to judge, it must be agreed, is a standard requiring judging to determine whether the standard has been followed or violated, as we've said. When one accuses another of judging, has he not judged that the other is judging? What shall we say then? Can it be possible that Jesus contradicted himself? No. These are apparent contradictions, not real contradictions. Jesus can neither lie nor contradict himself and remain faithful to himself. Since he defines himself as truth, we would be wise to try to understand his words in ways that are not contradictory, or else reject him as truth altogether, accepting the dire temporal in time and eternal consequences of that rejection. No half-stepping. Additionally, even in our communications with one another, fair play and the effort to truly and accurately understand one another compel us to view each other's statements in their most favorable light. Only when contradiction is indisputably committed should that accusation be made. To do otherwise would be unfair and untrue. We'll pick up at this point tomorrow. There's still a lot to talk about. Not a lot more in judging, but a lot more to talk about. Once again, I pray that God bless you this day and keep you safe. And remember, God's glory is the highest value, and death is by no means the worst thing that can happen. It's being unfaithful to him and detracting from his glory. God bless you. Have a wonderful day. Thank you.